Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. The topic today is a challenging one, at least it is for me. We're talking about emotional agility. From what I can tell, there are elements of behavioral psychology. There seems to be some tenets of Buddhism, and the best part is that there's a healthy dose of pragmatic action, specifically as it relates to workplace interactions. As you will see from this discussion, there are a whole host of intangible qualities that underpin emotional agility. My guest, or more accurately, my guide today, is Susan David, PhD. She's an award-winning psychologist on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, the co-founder and co-director of the Institute of Coaching at McLean Hospital, and the CEO of Evidence-Based Psychology, a boutique business consultancy. And of course, she's the author of the #1 Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Emotional Agility. Susan, welcome to Intangibles. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast, and thanks for taking the time to do this.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Good. You have a very interesting background. What else would you like to tell people about yourself that I didn't mention?
So I speak about this a lot in my just released TED Talk, which is really, I grew up in apartheid South Africa as a white South African. And around me was just a huge sense and horror at the injustice that was going on around me. And so from a very early age, I became interested in these questions, which is, what does it take internally in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories that help us to thrive in an imperfect world? And then when I was 15 years old, my father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And again, so many people around me were saying things like, just be positive, everything will be okay. And so I really started to explore the idea of human psychology, and what it really takes in the way we deal with our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories that help us to thrive. Because how we deal with our inner world drives every aspect of how we love, how we live, how we parent, and how we lead.
So, what I gather from that is that this was a passion for you from a very early age, not just an arbitrary decision of, okay, I'm going to graduate school or, and what should I study?
Yeah, I think that there was a passion, there was an interest. There were also experiences that I had as I landed up pursuing my studies in psychology. And I think, at core was this idea that there's this narrative that exists in the world around us. Things like just be positive, just be gritty.
Yeah.
And yet when you start looking at how human beings really work, what really helps us to thrive, sometimes it's not about just being gritty for the sake of it. Sometimes it's not about just being positive for the sake of it. Sometimes it's actually about being able to show up to our emotions and connect with our values, right, and make choices accordingly.
Process. Okay.
Yeah.
Look, as I've done my research for the discussion, I'll admit, I really only can come to a generalist grasp of the what, why, and how of emotional agility. It might be because I'm stunted, but maybe not. But so when we talk about this today, what I'm going to do, what I need to do is I need to break this topic down further for myself, probably as much as anyone listening. So I'm going to start here. By my estimation, emotional agility exists in this little tiny space that we create between stimulus and response. And if we do it right, it's the moment that we decide the best course of behavior to achieve whatever the optimal future stimulus is that we are desiring. Do I have this right?
Absolutely. So, Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi death camps, described this beautiful and profound idea, which is that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose, and it's in that choice that comes our growth and freedom. Now, so often we don't have a space between stimulus and response. So often what we do is we get hooked, is the language I use in emotional agility. We get hooked by our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories. So, for example, being hooked might be something like, I really, am so angry with the way this person's speaking to me in this meeting that I'm just not going to contribute anymore. And so what you do is you end up having this thought or this emotion that shuts you down and might be completely incongruent with your values, what you're trying to achieve with your business, what kind of leader you want to be. Or, gee, I would love that opportunity, but I'm not good enough for it. That's another way that we climb into a particular story and we get hooked by the story in a way that stops us from bringing the best of who we are to ourselves and to our lives. And so in emotional agility, I describe that so often there's not a space between stimulus and response. We treat our thoughts and our emotions and our stories as fact, and we let them direct our lives. And so there's some core, absolutely fundamental skills that allow us to be effective with our emotions so that we can make real choices and take effective action. And this, as it turns out, becomes critical to our leadership. It becomes critical to our businesses, to our ability to generate engagement and an effective culture in our organizations. Because what we're doing is we are able to kind of rise above what our thoughts, emotions, and stories might be telling us, and instead operate from the perspective of, who do I want to be here? What are my values telling me? What is going to be effective in this situation?
So in the event that you don't have a space, you need to make sure that you take time to create the space. And I'm going to extend here. I think what you're telling me is, in your mind, in that moment, you're playing 100 different little chess games out in the blink of an eye, and you're trying to gauge which outcome you think is the best outcome for you.
So some of these are in the blink of an eye. Some of these are, for instance, I'm sitting in a meeting and I'm being undermined. I'm just going to shut down. Or, my partner's starting in on the finances. I'm just going to leave the room because I can't deal with it at the moment. So often what we're doing is we're doing these kind of blink of the eye reactions rather than responses. But what we also know is that human beings react in very patterned ways. So we will often have the same type of reaction when we feel we're being undermined in meetings, year in and year out. And so, when we become more attuned to our emotions and to what is actually important to me, what we know is that we can be able to be more slow, more responsive. Dan Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for a lot of his work in this area, talks about system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is that very quick, intuitive response. System 2 thinking is that slower, more deliberate way of being. And that way of being is often informed by our values. Who do I want to be in this situation? What is the best outcome for me? And sometimes it's in the moment, and there's some very helpful strategies that enable us to be effective. And sometimes it's also about being able to recognize what are the ways of being that typically trip us up.
Right. And so, and this is, you were telling me earlier, there's process here, there's process here. But the reason that this is emotional agility and not process driven as much, at least it seems to me, is because fears, dreams, hopes, doubts, all of these kind of abstract feelings, they're present in our minds. And that dictates the decision in the moment has got to be less formulaic, right?
Yes. And, we live in a society that has a very one-sided view of emotions. These normal, natural emotions that are absolutely part and parcel of who we are as human beings. Fear, anger, sadness. These are normal human emotions. And yet we live in a society that has become very rigid about these types of emotions. We say that they're bad emotions. We say they're negative emotions. We think of them as being disruptive. And if we think of the call in our organizations that we've all got to be agile, we've got to be agile, we've got to be adaptive, we've got to be responsive. The idea that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad is rigid. And rigidity in the face of complexity is toxic. And so one of the core things that I propose in my work is that we only become more effective in our organizational world when we become friendly to our full emotional experience. You don't get innovation in an organization unless you open to the fear and the reality of that emotional experience that might come with failure. And so being open to our full range of emotions, which is contrary to what we are often fed, actually is critical to our resilience and our ability to be agile and adaptive in organizations.
Yeah. So let's agile. This is an interesting word, right? I assumed that the agile portion has to do with the fact that sometimes the best decision we can make is different from what our instinct might tell us is right.
Correct. And the other aspect of agility is being able to be sensitive to the context that you are in. So, for instance, when you have someone at the United Nations who's trying to bring vaccinations to children who are dying and who says something like, that politician spoke to me in the way that my father used to speak to me, and there's no ways that I'm going to return their phone call because they're so rude. What you have is you have someone crawling into a story that doesn't allow that person to be sensitive to the context that they're actually facing. What that person's doing is they're saying, well, if I had another politician or if I'd had a different childhood, I might be able to be different. But actually, what they're doing is they're often operating in a way that is against the interests of what they're trying to achieve in their work. And so part of agility is about being able to be in the moment with your thoughts and your emotions, to notice them for what they are. They're thoughts and emotions. They're not facts. They're not directives. And when we can do that, we can become more present to the context, the actual, what am I doing now? What am I trying to do? What is important to me here? And we can then take more values-based actions.
So, all right. Again, I just need to keep processing as I'm thinking about what you're telling me. It sounds like two things. One, get a little bit comfortable with the discomfort of some of these emotions that we tag as negative. And two, and I'm not sure if this is actually part of it or not, but it feels to me like if we slow things down a little bit in order to kind of take time to actually think about what's going on in the back of our mind, we could probably get better, right, in terms of reacting with the proper kind of emotional response.
Absolutely. So what I describe in emotional agility is I talk about how often we get hooked into ways of being that don't serve us. And then I describe 4 key processes of agility. The first is showing up. And what I mean by showing up is this idea of not pushing aside difficult emotions. And we know that a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of founders, a lot of business people do this. They say things like, I'm uncomfortable with this feedback from the client, but I'm just going to get on with it. Or I know my team's unhappy, but we've just got this project to move forward with. And so what we often do is we bottle our emotions, we push them aside. And what's fascinating is we know that when people do this, it actually undermines their effectiveness. It undermines their ability to achieve their goals. So the first part of emotional agility is showing up to our emotions, including the uncomfortable ones. The second part is what I call stepping out, which is where you start creating space between you and the emotion. So for instance, when you're sitting in a meeting and you're saying, I'm being undermined, I'm just going to be quiet, there's no space. And stepping out is about being able to create that space. One example is even being able to say something like, I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. or I'm noticing the thought that I should just shut down. What you're doing there is you're noticing the thought or emotion for what it is, a thought, not a fact. Then I talk about walking your why, which is the idea that if we are much more front and center with what our values are, what our leadership principles are, who we want to be in the world, this, as it turns out, becomes a powerful compass in the day-to-day ravages of change and complexity that we face in the organization. And then I talk about practical strategies, ways that we can make tiny changes to allow us to, generate the kinds of outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, the bottlers and the brooders. I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you covered it. When we were talking, I guess it was more than a couple of weeks ago now. It's amazing how time flies. I mentioned that I was interested in emotional agility as it relates to entrepreneurs, startup founders. These tend to be people who are usually super smart, type A, pretty process driven, at least from a technical perspective. But at the same time, they can be isolated, potentially consumed with self-doubt, no strangers to dysfunctional behavior. You started to touch on it, but maybe we could dig in a little more if there's more to dig on. What are the tools that these types of folks should employ?
So there are many, but, some examples are often when people are in the early stages of business or they're looking at taking risks. Often what people will do is they'll say things like, I'll do it when I'm ready or when the situation is right. And often that's self-doubt talking, or, when I've got more confidence, I'll be able to take that step. And the fact of the matter is again, that, often what this is it's crawling into a story that we have about whether we're good enough, whether we're deserving, whether, we are the person that is okay for a particular effective outcome. And so if you can, in that context, start noticing your thoughts and emotions again as thoughts and emotions, like I'm noticing that I'm having the thought that I don't deserve X, but I'm still going to choose to take actions in ways that are concordant with my values and the outcome that I want. That can be a very powerful place to be because you're no longer being held hostage by a thought, emotion, a story. Mm-hmm. Another example, which is more from a team context, is we know that when people are working in entrepreneurial environments, often there's a huge amount of stress. And what we know is that people in these kind of environments, as well as in the larger business environment, will often use very broad brushstrokes to describe how it is that they're feeling. So they'll say things like, I'm stressed. Everything becomes, I'm stressed. When you say you are stressed, it doesn't actually allow us to understand what is the cause. How can I enact solutions? Like, what do I actually need to do about this? So there's this fascinating body of psychology called emotion granularity. And what this shows is that when you do something super simple, which is more accurately label your emotion, there's a difference between stress versus disappointment, stress versus feeling alone and needing more support, stress versus, gee, I'm on a path that isn't actually working for me. That when we label our emotions more effectively, what it actually does is it activates what's called the readiness potential in our brains. And this starts to form our ability to act more effectively. And it's also associated with high levels of well-being and lower levels of depression and anxiety. So that's something that, a lot of people do where they'll say things like, I'm stressed, but there's huge power in being able to say, well, what are two other emotions that I'm feeling other than stress? Right. Then a third example, and then I'll but there are many, is when we're feeling stress, when we are in an entrepreneurial context or when we're in a team that's experiencing a lot of change, it can be very difficult for the leader and very difficult for the team. And yet we know that when someone as a leader says, okay, there is all this change going on around us, there is all this uncertainty, but what is our why? Who do we want to be with each other? What are our values in terms of how we want to operate? even in the context of this complexity, that this becomes incredibly important glue that binds the team towards a common goal. So these are some examples of, showing up to emotions, stepping out, which is the labeling of emotions more effectively, and walking your why. What is a kind of values-based way that you can be that is incredibly powerful?
So, of course, way leads on to way here. So there's obviously a couple of things that you touched on that I need to follow up on. The first is we talked about in organizations, ambiguity, started to touch on increased complexity. I'm particularly interested in drilling down on those. And the reason is because in a founder's life, I mean, that's the day. Every day is ambiguity and complexity and instinctual response.
Yes.
So I know there's not even a question there. A little bit more thought around.
Talk about it.
Yeah. How do you deal with it?
So this is really interesting. And of course, this is a conversation that is broadly applicable to every organization, which is organizations basically saying things like, we are experiencing great complexity. We need people to be agile. We need people to be adaptive. What's fascinating is that you don't just get agile organizations unless the people within the organizations are agile. So there is no organizational agility without psychological agility, without emotional agility. And the reason that I say that is because what's fascinating is that the same complexity that drives this call for agility is the complexity, paradoxically, that undermines our ability to be agile. And I'll explain what I mean. When people are experiencing huge amounts of information coming at them, multiple variables, diverse variables, different variables, we are much more likely, instead of being relational and connected and being able to deepen and strengthen the quality of our relationships, we become more transactional. So, you know that you've got a colleague who's got a sick child, but you can't even ask them because you've got 300 emails. And so you don't even get to that place. So we know that when people are experiencing a lot of complexity, instead of being relational, they become transactional. Instead of being able to think about their product, their challenges in the context of the broader offerings that are out there, what we tend to do is we tend to become much more black and white in our thinking. So we jump to conclusions or we become hooked on a particular way of doing something. We know that when people are feeling huge amounts of stress and huge amounts of ambiguity, they tend to not consider how their decisions might impact on another part of the organization. So what you have is you have this really, really interesting context in which complexity drives particular needs for the organization, and yet psychologically it outstrips our capacity to actually deal with that reality effectively. We become more black and white. We become much more closed down. We become much more competitive rather than collaborative. We become much more fearful. And so emotional agility becomes absolutely critical in these contexts, being able to slow down our thinking. That's not to say that intuitive thinking doesn't matter. Intuitive thinking is incredibly helpful. But when we are keeping on and on and on going down a particular path that's not helpful, intuitive thinking is now undermining us because we just doing what comes normally to us. And so emotional agility becomes critical in these spaces where you starting to feel overwhelmed, where you're starting to recognize your stress, where you're starting to recognize this such quick responsiveness that you may actually not be operating in an effective way. And I'll give you just one quick example, which is I was recently working with a company who is a relatively early stage organization. And every time they go to their big clients. The big clients say things like, can you do this? And can you do that? And can you do this with your, so what they keep doing is they keep coming back and changing their technology to be responsive to their clients. But at the same time, have this huge recognition now that they've moved further and further and further away in being opportunistic from what it is that they really want to do and who they really want to be as founders. And so this is a case where just being automatically reactive is stopping our ability to say, is this who I am? Is this a values-based response? Is this effective for me? Is this effective for my company in the marketplace?
So relational versus transactional, that sounds very Daniel Kahneman underpinned again. What I think I'm hearing you say is that the goodness here is that founders can actually cultivate emotional agility in others in their team.
Absolutely. Founders can cultivate emotional agility in themselves, and founders can cultivate emotional agility in their team. One example of this is when you have team members coming to work saying, I'm worried about X, or I'm concerned about this aspect of the product, or I'm, not sure if the path that we're taking is effective. Often when we're busy and when we are in complex environments, we push that stuff aside, just getting on with it. And so what we start to convey is the idea that there's no place for that concern. There's no place for that in our organization. And yet we know that the most effective organizations, the most effective teams, Google's study is probably the most well known on this in terms of psychological safety, are places where people, individuals, team members feel that they are able to bring the fullness of their emotional experience to the workplace, and that it's in that space that innovation happens, because people are kind of recognizing that there's innovation that comes hand in hand with failure, but that they're not going to be spat out of the organization if something doesn't work. So what you have is when a leader is open to the fullness of emotional experience, when a leader is able to say, so what exactly is the concern and who do we want to be in this situation, and is able to really help the team to cultivate a shared sense of why, that becomes fundamental to that team's ability to be agile.
I like that answer. And I like also the notion that you're putting forward there that this kind of self-awareness, whether it's looking back on decisions we've made or whether it's talking ourselves through a decision in the moment, allows us to become better and better and become more and more emotionally agile.
I think this is critical because at the end of the day, there's no map. None of us has a map that we were born with that is going to tell us what we should do in every situation. And so often what happens is we turn to the world around us. We see someone driving a fancy car and we want to drive that car, or social contagion where, we know, for instance, that if you're trying to lose weight and someone on an airplane buys candy, your chance of buying candy increases 70%. Like, we know that we are really impacted in very subtle ways by other people's demands and wants and what other people are doing. And what that can do is it can take us off course. It can take us off course in our lives, in our careers, and in our businesses, where we land up doing stuff and then feeling that there's such a huge distance from what we had originally hoped for and how things have transpired. And so a very, very strong sense of who is it that I want to be? What is important to me? Are the risks, or are the things that I'm sacrificing here, are they worthwhile? These are really important questions that we should be asking ourselves. Otherwise we land up in 10 years or 15 years and we're in a place that we have somehow got into on autopilot rather than got into in a way that is thoughtful, aware, and connected ultimately with the person that we want to be in the world.
So I've got a question here, and it's a non sequitur, but being that I actually have a PhD in front of me, I'm just going to go ahead and ask it anyway. Thank you. What's going on physiologically inside ourselves, if you can answer, at the moment that all of this internal calculus is happening?
Well, so there's a whole complex thing that's happening. Often what would happen in psychology is people would say things like, well, what comes first? Is it the thought that comes first, or is it an emotion that comes first? Like, what predicts what? And what we know is that a lot of our emotional experience arises, simultaneously in very, very complex ways. At the same time, and again, bringing back to the leaders, the individuals in the organizational context, is what we know is that most of us live our lives in our heads and are often actually kind of not necessarily connected when they're in a meeting and they experience physiologically a sense of disquiet or a gnawing feeling of, gee, this thing that I'm agreeing to is actually not something that I want to be doing. And so a really important aspect of emotional agility is this call, I think, for us to move from the idea that we just in our heads and these human doings where we're doing and executing, into recognizing that such an important part of our well-being and our ability to live an effective whole life is born out of being able to be more connected with what's going on, what am I feeling inside me, what is this emotion, what is this emotion telling me, what can I learn from it? It's not fact, but what might I be able to learn from it? These become critical. Who's in charge, the thinker or the thought? Often when we are in situations at work or when we're upset by someone, the thought is in charge. The thought tells us what to do and we act. And what I'm really proposing with emotional agility is that the thinker, the us, the person who has a whole value set and a whole lot of intentions and dreams that are often very wise inside of ourselves gets more voice.
Right. Honestly, I think what you're talking about is openness. Frankly, just being able to say, this is what is going on. I'm acknowledging it. I'm processing it. And once you do that, it can potentially lead to more pure decisions.
Yeah, it's openness, it's curiosity. When you're curious about your emotions, when you're curious about what's going on with the team, it's also compassion. We live in a world, and I think especially for many of your listeners, we live in a world that would have us believe that we are in a never-ending Iron Man or Iron Woman competition, where having self-compassion seems completely, as if you're being weak and lazy. But we know people who are self-compassionate tend to be more honest with themselves. They tend to expect higher things of themselves because they're creating a safe space in which they can try things out and they're not rejecting of themselves when things don't work out. So these are kind of fundamental, critical human skills that are core to our success, and that can also be practically acquired and achieved.
Yep, I agree. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. This is the VC question that I sometimes ask. I sit across the table from folks all the time, and I know that I'm looking for people with a high emotionally agile quotient. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a simpleton question, but how do I recognize the people that are coming to the table fully formed, more emotionally agile than others? What behaviors, how do they hold themselves? How do they answer, respond? What do I look for?
So I think a core part of this is the person's ability to, when you're seeing someone who actually sees you as a person in front of them. And what I mean by this is someone who is showing you in the meeting that they are listening, that they're curious, that they don't have all the answers, which is, again, this idea of climbing into a quick story that then gets reacted to in an autopilot way. So this idea of being able to be curious, to be able to be listening, to be able to convey a sense of kindness, I think these things are critical, and they're not at odds with being, a really, really successful business person. They show someone who is able, especially in an entrepreneurial context where every single person on your team can make or break the team, especially in the early days. They show someone who is actually kind of attuned, which translates to attuned to the market, attuned to what's going on within the organization, attuned to clients' needs. These kind of skills, this kind of listening, courage, curiosity, kindness, I think these things become critical litmus tests in the almost in-context interaction with an individual.
It's strange. It feels like you're just describing humanness.
And isn't that right? And isn't that so often, I strongly believe, I work in a lot of organizations in people strategy, and what I think so often has happened, especially in very large organizations, 180,000 people, 200,000 people, is there is this industrial age view of people, this idea that there's a massive change going on in the organization. Let's just tell people what the change is. Let's scale it down. Let's tell people what to believe, and people will believe it. Or we've got new values that are different from last year's values, and we're going to tell people what the values are, and people are going to act them. There's this idea that human beings are almost machine-like, that you can put information in one part of the machine and then you're going to have different behaviors at the other end. And I think there's been a dehumanizing of us as people, and also there's a fear of the normal, natural human emotions. And yet when you look at teams that are most engaged, that have the best cultures, and that have, outstanding brand favorability, revenues, and so on, and I've done a lot of research in this context, you find that it's these human qualities that actually seem so intangible and yet have real predictable outcomes.
Dr. David, that is all that I have prepared. I like to finish up typically with 3 things just to get the word out. The first thing is, I guess I should say, is there anything that I didn't bring into the conversation about emotional agility that you feel like is a glaring omission and you'd like to talk to?
No, I think we've got good coverage.
Yeah, so, I thought that was right. Number 2, besides your book on the topic, any materials or resources that you would point people to dive deeper?
So the book Emotional Agility, a lot of people find very, very helpful a quiz that I have online on my website. So it's susandavid.com, SUSANDAVID, susandavid.com/learn. That's a 5-minute quiz that about 100,000 people have taken now and gives people a free 10-page report. And then the last thing that I would say is my TED Talk, which was released about a month ago, which is called The Gift and Power of Emotional Courage. Those 3 resources are probably good places to start.
That's fantastic. And that actually does answer the third question. I was going to say, where can people find you? But clearly the website is one place, TED Talk another place. Any place else that you need people to chase
across all social media. So okay. LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook.
All right. Let's call it a wrap then. Thank you so much. I know I know that you keep a pretty full schedule. So I know how important time is to you, and I appreciate you taking the time. This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, The Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glawi, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve Berg.